I would like to immediately pass the floor to Matthew Griffin, who comes from London, who is usually used to travel everywhere for keynote speeches. Right now he's a bit more sedate. He came here last night and he just learned that if he wasn't back 5 o'clock next morning, he would be in quarantine. So Matthew, if you have maybe visited his site, will give us a perspective and an opening not only for the 10, 20 next years, but even up to 2050 and beyond. So Matthew, the floor is yours.
Bonjour, comment allez-vous? C'est très spécial cette période en ce moment.
But the lights are slightly blinding.
Alors, j'aimerais bien vous voir.
It's a sign of the times that just before I came on stage, basically the hand sanitizer exploded all over my suit, which is always fun. And it's good to be on stage again. I haven't been on stage for probably sort of about 5 months. And just the experience of wearing trousers is quite unique. That's it, bearing in mind all the virtual events basically that we've sort of been doing. So what I've done basically is I've prepared a presentation for you on the future of energy in the year, as it is in the year 2050. And are you okay to go? Oh, okay, start it. There we go. So I hope you enjoy it. What I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and stretch your thinking a little bit. And I'm going to show you some energy types that you may not have actually considered or thought about before. So, with no further ado, how long does it take today to create an electric vehicle, lithium-ion battery from scratch? Now, if I ask you, would it take a couple of days? Hands up. A couple of days. No, no one says a couple of days. What about a couple of weeks? Anyone saying a couple of weeks? Oh, okay, a couple of weeks. Couple of years? Couple of years, right? So, okay, so we've got, what, 80% of you roughly saying a couple of years. So by the year 2050, we're moving to real-time innovation across a whole variety of sectors, not just energy and not just energy products. The way that we do that is via something called creative machines. Now, creative machines are essentially a combination of artificial intelligence with virtual worlds. You can build them in a whole variety of different ways. Today, virtual machines basically are able to iterate products. So you can take a product, you can digitize it, and a creative machine will create an iterative new version of it. Whether it is Amazon using these technologies to design new fashion lines, in silico using these technologies to design 30,000 drugs in 21 days, NASA using them to design lunar rovers, General Motors using them to design cars, you kind of get the picture. So today we're in the iterative stage. By 2050 we get to disruptive. In fact, we get to disruptive really by about 2030. So, in answer to the question, how long does it take to design a new EV battery? Who put their hands up for a few days? No one, because you're wrong. A few weeks? Who put your hands up? You're right. So, Toyota used an artificial intelligence to create a new type of EV lithium-ion battery and test it within 16 days. Now, if you think about time to market, what does that do for the speed of innovation within the energy sector when you can start creating new products at that kind of pace? Bearing in mind that these are little baby steps at the moment. When these technologies start maturing, this stuff gets faster, which means that the pace of change within your industry gets faster. Now, what I talked about there basically was the combination of two different technologies. Artificial intelligence, essentially with virtual worlds. However, when we look at the pace of change is accelerating, not because there are two exponential technologies, but because there are hundreds. I track over 450. They're represented on this starburst. This starburst has about 180 emerging technologies on there. And the way that it works is you go around the circle, because if you want to make a product, you need advanced manufacturing, you need compute, you need connectivity, you need electronics, you need energy, you need intelligence, materials, and all these kinds of things. Now, from an energy sector perspective, the sort of exponential technologies that you should be paying attention to, particularly from an innovation perspective, should be advanced manufacturing, so 3D printing, for example. Biotech, you should be paying attention to gene editing, so technologies like CRISPR, which are probably completely alien to you, because they change the energy paradigm considerably, and we'll come into that. Other things basically you should be paying attention to basically is in the field of intelligence and electronics. On the electronic side of things, we have 3D printed electronics, flexible electronics, and all kinds of things. We have thin film batteries coming through as a result of that. The energy sector itself is one of the most active sectors that I track by a country mile. Over the past 2 to 3 years, the amount of innovation in the energy sector has accelerated way beyond the amount of innovation that I see in the compute, even the biotech sectors. Part of that is driven by the rise of the electrification of the transportation industry, simply because, let's face it, investors basically see a big opportunity to do something different there, so they're backing a whole variety of new technologies. But as you can see, we've got a whole variety of technologies coming through, everything from things like quark energy, which is a theoretical sort of energy technology, which is 8 times more powerful than fusion. That was first sort of detected by CERN up the road. All these different technologies are available in the codex. So if you go to /explore on the website, if you want a copy of the codex, basically it tells you everything about all these different technologies and all the other ones as well. But when you start combining these different technologies together, that's when you get the real innovation. So we'll walk through a few. So by 2050, we have one unified global energy grid. When you have a look at the super international grids, basically particularly the Asian grids and the European grids, those are already starting to be connected. We have virtual power plants. So exponential technologies democratize and decentralize everything. Whether it is health, I can decentralize a health service. If I want to see whether or not I have cancer, I simply hold my smartphone up in front of my face, and using machine vision and artificial intelligence combined with the camera in my smartphone, the system can tell whether I have yellowy eyes and tell whether or not I have pancreatic cancer. So the reason why I sort of bring this up is the concept of decentralization and democratization of every type of product or service that you deliver is highly relevant both to the energy sector. So for example, we can take decentralized energy generation platforms, whether you call them tied storage, microgrids, solar panels on the roofs, or whatever it happens to be, tie them together with blockchain, and now all of a sudden aggregate all of that energy generation together to create a virtual power plant. And over in California, they actually decided not to move ahead with 3 physical power plants because that's how they did it. When we start getting to really 2030, energy is free. Now, of course, energy is never genuinely free because as companies, you wrap services around it. But energy generation is free. Now, if you want evidence of this for yourselves, because I could just be talking bunk, go and have a look on Google, have a look at the cost of energy generation for any type of technology, whether it's coal, whether it's nuclear, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, doesn't matter. You will see graphs that do this. Now, exponential technologies, again, are very good at changing the economics of an industry. So if your company is reliant on selling energy, if this freaks you out, you need to be moving your business now. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples just to kind of back this up. So if you have a look at digital cameras, the digital cameras in your smartphones basically started off in 1976 with Kodak. The cost per megapixel in 1976 was $7.2 million, adjusted for inflation. Today, the cost of the cost per megapixel is $0.041. That represents a cost change of over 1.75 billion. So within the space of about 50-ish years, the cost of digital cameras and the cost per performance, so cost per megapixel in this case, fell by 1.7 billion fold. Think of this as a solar panel. What happens basically if the cost of energy generation drops by 1.75 billion? However, there's more. When you have a look at the storage, we're giving storage away now in the cloud pretty much with things like Amazon S3. For $10 a month, I can buy a box contract and get unlimited amounts of storage. Storage is even worse. So in 1956, the cost of 1 gig would have cost about $820 million. Today, it's 0.055, and this is plummeting still. So that's a drop of 15 billion fold. And if you think basically that exponential technologies reduce the cost of just these technologies and have nothing to do with the energy sector, you're wrong. This applies basically to communications. It applies to compute. It applies to all sorts of things. But anyway, as we start having a look at 2050, some of the way that we do things, if you step back sort of 10 years ago, if I wanted to turn the lights on to my house, what I would personally have needed is I would have needed a number of companies to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in digging oil out of the ground. I would have then needed companies to invest tens of billions of dollars in power stations and electrical infrastructure. Now I can go and buy some solar panels, stick them on the roof, I can disconnect myself from the grid. And if I don't take out a maintenance contract on those solar panels, my cost of energy generation and my cost of electricity for my home is free, decentralized and democratized. However, here we go. Now, I'm going to show you this. In 2050, basically, we can do a variety of different things. So what we have here, have we got some sound? What we have here, because you remember I said about technology combinations. What we have here, basically, is 3D printing houses. Now, at the moment, basically, you're going to be thinking, well, what does a 3D printed house have to do with anything? But just to demonstrate where we already are today, what would happen if I could 3D print a house, complete, with its own nuclear reactor? That sounds insane, it sounds stupid, basically, and you'd tell me that I'm crazy. Yeah, exactly, I can hear sniggers. I can't see, but I can hear sniggers. So this is a company here, basically 3D printed an entire community of houses down in Mexico within 24 hours using 3D printing technology. However, so we've 3D printed a house, and this technology gets better, faster, cheaper, more ubiquitous as we move on. However, I said about 3D printing a nuclear reactor. This is the US Department of Energy and the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory 3D printing a miniature nuclear reactor in a lab, complete with a nuclear core. It's an experimental reactor, but if we're able to 3D print experimental nuclear reactors in a lab today, by 2050, this technology is easily mature. However, let's face it, no one really probably wants a nuclear reactor to power their home. So now we start flipping these constructs. What happens if you start 3D printing houses with photovoltaic materials and all these sorts of things, different energy generation technologies, and I've got some other things to show you. So what we can do is, as we're 3D printing buildings, we can 3D print the energy infrastructure, whether it's generation, distribution, whatever it happens to be, directly into the building itself. Now, as we start talking about energy distribution, wireless energy, but in this case, we're talking more about long-range wireless energy rather than the wireless energy that's powering your phone. So Company called Emrod, basically they're now doing long-range wireless. Basically these go up to a couple of kilometers. But again, when we have a look at long-range wireless energy transmission, whether it's microwave, whether it's laser, whether it's even Wi-Fi, so we're able to use Wi-Fi and turn Wi-Fi into electricity now, we start getting to the point basically where you have a wireless energy internet. And when you start being able to transmit energy wirelessly from point A to point Z, you have to then ask yourself a question, do you actually need batteries? Because if I can wirelessly charge my car basically as it's driving around, does it need a battery? No. And we've got a variety of ways to get rid of the batteries. Do I need dams? If you have a look at the Hoover Dam, it's a $4 billion battery. When we have a look at grid-scale storage systems, if I can transmit energy wirelessly, do I need grid-scale storage? Not in all cases. And in fact, in most cases, as this technology gets better, the answer is no. As for energy generation itself, though, new nano-manufacturing technologies mean that we can harness backscatter energy. So in this room, whether it's vibrations, whether it's the screechy sound of my voice, or whether it is just plain vibrations, you can print materials now, 3D print nanomaterials, basically that have got small cilia. And we've used these technologies to create what we call backscatter systems for smartphones. So we've already, via Samsung, created smartphones basically that don't have any batteries. We also have batteries that charge when you speak into them, using acoustic, vibrations. So when we start having a look at our ability just to pull energy out of our environment in a whole variety of different ways, whether it's solar, whether it's whatever it happens to be, there's a whole variety of different things that we can do. Piezoelectric fabrics. Increasingly, piezoelectric fabrics are getting to the point basically where they are robust, they can stand thousands of washing cycles and all that kind of stuff. But as the technology starts integrating with clothing, as it starts disappearing, we have piezoelectric fabrics that power all of the different compute. Because just as energy is changing, the world of compute is changing. Computers are getting smaller, CPUs are getting smaller. We have biological computers already starting to come through over in China, quantum computers coming up. None of the sectors that are interconnected to any of these products basically are staying still, whether it's for wearables or sensors or whatever it happens to be. When we have a look at the world of catalysts, increasingly, basically, we have a way to produce hydrogen fuel, basically, at pretty much zero cost. We can also turn seawater into unlimited amounts of fuel for cargo ships. So all of a sudden, we have a way to get rid of bunker fuel, which contributes, about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions? And that's before we start talking about the electrification of ships and all these sorts of things, as we're already doing in China. Fusion energy, when you have a look at ITER basically has now started its build. ITER basically was conceived in a time basically when we actually thought that the best way to generate energy was by building a huge chunk of single monolithic infrastructure and putting it somewhere. But if I can take the cost of electricity generation using all these different technologies down to near zero, does ITER now make commercial sense? So I sat with a whole bunch of people who were building some of the nuclear power stations in the UK. We're spending 26 billion euro building a power station up near Warrington. And these are the people who are building it. And they all were sitting down with one another and going, by the time this nuclear power station is online, it's just going to be used for boost. The economics of the industry are changing. Now, here, we also have the concept of nanogenerators. So again, coming out of China, but also the US, we're able to start harvesting electricity from your blood. So a little bit like a turbine, like a hydroelectric pump or turbine, we can use nanobots and nanogenerators to start generating electricity from your blood, as well as your body, from the cells in your body and all these sorts of things. Now, these could be used to power a whole variety of biological supercomputers. But let's face it, from a use case perspective, interesting, but we haven't quite figured out what we'd actually use these things for yet. But they're already coming through. Solar energy by 2050, solar electricity generation basically is ubiquitous. So spray-on solar, for example, basically is already in the works, and that's literally as it sounds. So you have spray-on solar where you can embed a whole variety of different sensors, different technologies and everything else. And this is actually also now being designed by an artificial intelligence. So the first spray-on solar technologies will probably come through in the labs in about the next 2 to 3 years. But that suddenly means you can apply solar panels, shall we say, to anything. We also have flexible solar and everything else, which are already being put onto cars, et cetera, et cetera. As for record efficiencies, today most commercial solar panels are 17%. So, I talk about the cost of electricity generation doing this. The US Department of Energy just produced a solar panel or solar concentrator that's 48% efficient. But we have we've got Perscovite cells, which are 32% efficient. They're 3D printed. We have solar cells that are 50% efficient. But I said at the start, pay attention to gene editing. The 50% solar panel, basically, is not a silicon solar panel or a Perscovite solar panel. It is biological. It's made out of bacteria. The 80%, we can get to 80% by using carbon nanotubes. That was another technology on the material part of the starburst to reclaim heat from solar panels. And then by 2050, we are starting to get to 135% energy efficiency, bearing in mind that you end up with some material decay thanks to black silicon. So for every photon that hits black silicon, thanks to 3D nano printing now, we're able to kick out 1.32 electrons. And of course, you can't get 0.32 of an electron, but when you sort of look at the material overall, you get to 130, it's actually 132 to 135%. So when we start talking about the efficiency of solar, we're nowhere near the limits. Rain or snow, basically, if you take a solar panel, you apply graphene over the top of it. As water runs over the top of that solar panel, you can generate electricity from that. Again, using 3D nano printing and 3D printing technology, we have already produced solar panels, which is the wrong name for them, that produce electricity at night. So this whole concept, basically, of needing grid-scale storage because solar panels only generate electricity during the day, all of this starts going away. So do you have a point of view? Indoors as well. When we start having a look at the development of nanophotonic materials that can capture different wavelengths of light with different levels of efficiency, we can start using solar indoors. So your child's toy could simply be made out of a photovoltaic material, but not in the traditional way you might think, and don't need batteries. When we have a look at from 2025 onwards, we are already at the point with NASA and the Chinese government where they are now starting to put plans in place to 3D and 4D print orbiting space stations, satellites, systems in orbit. So by 2025, the Chinese government want to put a solar power station in orbit. These things will start generating gigawatts worth of electricity. It'll be transmitted down to Earth using, in these cases, laser and microwave transmission systems to base stations down on the ground. Now, if you have a base station down on the ground and you have a globally interconnected energy grid, this can just be transmitted anywhere that you like. So these technologies by 2050 are all the way through. When we look at energy storage, grid-scale storage, we have liquid fuels, we have molten salt storage, tide storage. We have a whole variety of different ways already, basically, to store electricity at relatively okay costs, but those costs continue to plummet. We also have a way using nanofibers to turn bricks, just traditional red bricks that cost about 65 cents each, into batteries. So what happens if you can turn buildings themselves into batteries? Bearing in mind that as we 3D print buildings by 2050, you don't necessarily use brick, but you might use polymers or recycled plastics or a whole variety of other custom materials. So what happens basically when you can turn every new building in a city into a battery? And then, of course, when we look at batteries themselves, there's a whole variety of innovations. I mean, there are thousands, literally. We only have a little bit of time together. But we move from fossil fuels. We've got biofuels now. Again, if you have a look at biofuels, gene editing lets us do a whole variety of crazy things, basically, with the world of biology. So particularly things like synthetic biology. We have boostable lithium-ion batteries that are already coming through. That's important basically for electric aircraft, basically in aviation, particularly when they take off. Polymer batteries, basically we have bio batteries. Bio batteries basically are very, very useful for powering Internet of Things devices and things that are technically disconnected from the grid. Biohybrid PV, so we talked a little bit about that. Printed lithium-ion batteries, we'll talk about that. Photovoltaic materials, structural batteries, and then obviously wireless energy transmission. But when we have a look at 3D printed batteries, if you can 3D print just a bog standard lithium-ion battery, and this is before we start getting to lithium sulfur, lithium calcium, lithium metal, we've been able to use 3D printing already at the nanoscale to increase the surface area of anodes to create standard lithium-ion batteries that are 400% more dense than their predecessors. The manufacturing piece is very, very important when we look at the future of energy, because that drives a lot of these sort of rather crazy innovations. And then when we have a look at things like biobatteries, this is a little bit of fun. When we have a look at biobatteries, things like aqueous biobatteries, they'll be very useful for smart contact lenses. And again, just to sort of prove where we are today, let alone by 2050, what you're seeing here is not actually a stock image. This is the world's first augmented reality contact lens made by a company called Mojo Vision. It's wirelessly charged, but it also uses an aqueous biobattery, which is based on the sort of skills or the nature of an electric eel. Structural batteries. When we start combining carbon nanotubes basically with different materials, we can turn the products themselves into the batteries. This is a Lamborghini. It's called the Lamborghini Terzo Millennio, because Terzo Millennio means third millennium. You can turn, in this case, basically the shell, the carbon fiber shell of this hypercar into the battery. We recently had breakthroughs in other structural batteries with things like biomorphic batteries for robots. They're a type of structural battery. So what happens basically when you can eliminate the battery, or what happens basically when the product itself becomes the battery? And then, of course, I don't want to leave this one out in this golden age of travel that we live in, rocket fuel. NASA and SpaceX have been developing green rocket fuel, and I typically keep getting asked about rockets and are they green, and are we doing anything basically in the world of rockets. But let's face it, if we are going to be traveling around the world by rockets, we can't keep burning liquid oxygen. So this is coming 2025, it's just a little bit of fun. And no, it's not working. No. So this one's just a little bit of fun, but this has already been flight tested around 70 times. And it's from SpaceX. But the reason why when we start talking about green rocket fuel becomes important is because companies like SpaceX want to transport you from one side of the planet to the other much quicker than we do today. So it does generally have sound. But if you've been watching SpaceX closely, this is a reusable rocket based on the Falcon 9. The top part of the vehicle is actually based on the Falcon Heavy, which is now being called Starliner. But these rockets travel around the world at Mach 27. So inevitably, bearing in mind that as these different technologies come through, the FAA over in the US have already granted flight approval for these. If you watch the Crew Dragon launches, basically where SpaceX are now the taxi service for NASA taking astronauts up to the International Space Station, that's their testing ground. But invariably, really sort of from 2025 to 2030, we'll start being able to realize a point where we can travel from one side of the planet to the other within about 30 to 40 minutes. So when we have a look at the different applications and uses of energy and energy products, there are billions. There are some that haven't been invented yet. Basically, there are some still to come through, but there's lots of things basically that we can do. So hopefully you enjoyed the sort of quick jaunt basically through the future of energy. And that's it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Merci. Thank you, Matthew. So we have got a set of questions that I will.
Première porte sur la gratuité de l'énergie. On parle de la gratuité de l'énergie en 2050 alors que les ressources sont limitées, on a de moins en moins de ressources. Comment peut-on parler de cette gratuité de l'énergie?
It tells you. Things like CNN, the Crisis News Network, basically will tell you that day in, day out. So let's break this down. Firstly, when we have a look at energy and energy abundance, we don't have a lack of energy. The sun provides some extraordinary number when it comes to the amount of energy and energy that it bathes the earth in. What we have at the moment, basically, is a relatively novice way of capturing it. We don't have a lack of energy. I'm generating energy when I'm walking around the stage. We can capture that. But is it commercially feasible to do so? Do we have the products and all that kind of stuff? When we start having a look at, for example, food. So I'll give you, food is one of the perfect examples. You know, we have over 1 billion people today who live in famine or live in hunger. We have the technology now to create vertical farms that produce 8 organic crops a year. They're starting to be rolled out. We also have the ability to take a single stem cell from one chicken, put it into something called a bioreactor. So you might have heard of clean meat, lab-produced meat, all these sorts of things. They aren't fake meat. They aren't plant-based alternatives. They're real meat. We can take one stem cell from one chicken, grow chicken nuggets in a bioreactor, and we can feed everybody on the planet really from one original stem cell. You don't need chickens. I literally have a video, if you want to see it, just ask me, it's on the sites and everything else. I literally have a video of a company taking a stem cell from a chicken feather and eating chicken nuggets that are made from the meat of that chicken while the chicken itself is walking around. Yeah. When we have a look at connectivity, we have space systems, we have low Earth orbit satellite systems going up right now. Again, SpaceX have permission to launch 12,000 that will provide internet connectivity to the other 3.5 billion people on the planet. We have more connectivity, more compute. We have access to new ways to produce food. We have access to abundant sources of energy. It's not a question of a lack of resources. Arguably, it's a question of our lack of ability to tap into them or to do things in new ways. When you look at education, education is a scarce resource. We have 650 million children basically around the world basically that can't read, really, you know, or are generally illiterate. You provide them with a laptop and internet connectivity thanks to space-based satellite systems. All of a sudden, education becomes abundant. You know, content is abundant. When we have a look at the way that we manufacture products at the moment, we rip huge amounts of commodity product basically out of the earth. You know, we'd never recycle it. You know, so recycling systems are coming through. So the concept basically that we actually live in a resource-scarce world, there is a little bit of truth in that. But increasingly, we are using all these different technologies to produce new things in new ways. Even diamonds. Diamonds is a scarce resource, right? There's a company called Diamond Foundry over in the US. They take carbon dioxide, methane, basically in good old water, and produce diamonds. You want diamonds on tap? The ultimate scarce resource? We have a way to create abundant amounts of diamonds. And again, I have, you know, if anyone wants to sort of see those, basically, then, you know, just ask me and I can show you.
Thank you, Matthew. Maybe just the last question. Yeah. It's around us as human beings. It's around our health. Yeah. I mean, if you have wireless energy, if you have all this interconnectivity, will we still be in good health?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's actually increasingly divisive. So when we first brought out the first microwaves and the first radios, everyone thought they were going to get fried. When we brought out 4G, everyone thought we were going to get fried. When we brought out 5G, or now that we're rolling out 5G, basically people still think we're going to get fried. Really, basically, when we start having a look at some of these wireless energy transmission systems, when we start having a look at things like 6G technologies, which are based on terahertz, there is a lot of evidence to demonstrate basically that they aren't harmful to human cells. However, increasingly, you have to kind of think basically that there is some form of consequence to being flooded with lots of different types of radiation and electromagnetic radiation from all over the place. But at the moment, I remember back in the 2000s, everyone was being told your smartphone is going to give you cancer. Because you're always holding your smartphone to your ear, and whether it was the Bluetooth sensor in there or whatever it happened to be, it was going to give you a brain tumor. How many people have had brain tumors from smartphones? So it's a very divisive issue. There's lots of different sort of peer-reviewed research out there, but generally so far, basically, there has not been a mass health problem, seemingly, from radiation.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you very much.
Okay, take care.
On a eu quelques questions, quelques remarques aussi.
Which said, based on my knowledge in physics, mathematics, this could just be science fiction, what Matthew presented to us. Yes, in a way this is true, but we also know that science fiction, as it was conceived last century, 70, 80 years ago, now has become reality. So yes, maybe it does sound like science fiction, and I think that's also the mission of a futurologist, to think out of the box. And I think the message behind this is that if we are steered by our limits today, then we will never get to where we want to be. So the limits of today are there, but we need to think further and attack things in a very different way, from a different angle.